Regardless of what fantasy universe you might dive into, the general idea is always the same. The author wants the universe to be as immersive as possible. This is why we usually talk about different nations, with different races, with different cultures behind them. But more importantly, they all also have their own languages. And since League of Legends has a proper high fantasy universe, one might wonder, can the champions actually understand each other? Also, how many languages are there? I mean, especially if you are in Europe, all it takes for you is to travel outside of your own country and you can't understand anyone anymore. So is it the same case in League? Well, the answer to that is simply, it's complex. But yes, technically speaking, all the regions of Runeterra have their own languages. And yes, all the languages are completely different from each other, with some big overlaps being included. Those overlaps, of course, being Noxus. And so yes, it is Noxus that actually makes everything complex. You see, the truth is that the League universe is by far not the only one that is facing the same issue. Pretty much every fantasy universe has to face the same immersion-breaking problem. And the vast majority of the universes solve it in the exact same way. Usually we are talking about the idea that the universe has one universal language. And so the majority of the fantasy world would use that. I mean, imagine if English actually became the world's language. Everyone would know how to speak it, but all the other countries would still have their own languages. This is how, for example, World of Warcraft solved this issue. But for no reason at all, Blizzard took it a step further. The most spoken language there is called Common, and of course it is the language of the humans. So even if you play a dwarf, you can speak Common, but you can also use Dwarvish if you want. Now, where this goes a step further is in the fact that both the Horde and the Alliance have their own common language, with the Horde using Orcish for the language that everyone knows. And of course, because the Alliance is using Common and the Horde is using Orcish, the two sides can't understand each other. When it comes to gameplay, this is there so the two sides can't flame each other, but of course, players are creative. But if that's the case, if they too have multiple languages...
Let me explain.
I thought I smelled the stench of Alliance pigs.
Why does everyone still understand each other? Well, that's where all the fantasy worlds, including League of Legends, have to take a step back and think about practicality. Yes, canonically, these heroes shouldn't be able to understand each other, not unless one of them is multilingual. But still, they do understand each other, and they do because of gameplay. And because gameplay is king, that's where the priority is. In League of Legends, this can be seen everywhere. Sometimes you have characters from different nationalities that met and it's not really an issue. Sometimes you have champions that swapped nationalities entirely and it's never mentioned. But the most obvious one are all the voice lines that champions have against each other, even though they speak totally different languages. But this language barrier simply never comes up because it would be boring if nobody understood each other. And so they just do. Don't ask why. What we should be asking instead is, how many different languages are there and how different are they from each other? And so, let's dive into exactly that. Let's start with the one language that might be the most widely used for very obvious lore reason, and of course, it is Noxian. The reason why this language is everywhere is pretty simple. It's because Noxus is everywhere. Because it is a conquering nation, they really try to spread around. And as a result, all the surrounding nations kinda have to learn Noxian, so they can at least communicate when they try to surrender. But even though Noxus directly spreads its own language through conquest, the history behind that language also didn't come from nowhere. During the times of Mordekaiser's reign, yes, we got a chance to talk about Mordekaiser again, the base language of Noxus slightly varied depending on what region you were from. And because the barbaric lands of the Noxian tribes were vast and they were pretty much all over the entire main continent, it is highly likely that all the other languages around this area are based on the primitive Noxian. I mean, truth be told, that is exactly how the Germanic languages on Earth evolved. But even during these ancient times, Mordekaiser himself learned about some other forgotten languages. For example, many of you will know that Mordekaiser's real name was Sun Uzal, which was his name in the Noxai language. But this name could be then translated into Mordekaiser using Oknun, the language of the dead. And of course, most people don't know that this language even exists because it is spoken by the dead. So, if we had to stay canon, it would be really funny if the moment Mordekaiser ults you into his death realm, you couldn't understand him anymore. Anyway, later on, when the barbaric tribes formed into the Noxian Empire, all of those primitive languages merged into one, the Noxian, also shortened as the Nox. However, just like how it happens in real life, this language also varies depending on the region. And so, outside of the Nox, we also know about one other dialect, which is the Vannox, or Vannoxian. What's cool is that the lore also gave us some examples of the words that are used in these languages. For example, the Noxtora is an Noxian word that can be translated into a gateway to Noxus. Of course, we know that the Noxtora are these black gates that mark all the Noxian paths. So, the meaning of the word actually makes sense. Now, when it comes to the visual side of the language, we can find great examples of the Noxian script in the Demonic Compendium, which was confirmed to be written by Noxian mages. And the same script is used everywhere to mark Noxian letters. From the old Tahm-Kench teaser where it appeared the first time, to Rel's original teaser which was her wanted poster, to even Samira using Noxian script for her combo letters. Riot is simply very consistent in using the Noxian script. Even cooler, in Legends of Runeterra, when Tahm-Kench levels up, you can see he signs a deal with Jack, using a Noxian script. Now, as we mentioned, historically speaking, there is a really high chance that the original Noxai languages influenced the rest of the continent. But if there is one region that really has to deal with Noxian right now, it is Piltover. Now, throughout the years before Arcane, we actually got a lot of stories where Piltovans were kicking out Noxian spies. And they could always tell them apart because of their heavy Noxian accent. Which already confirmed that there are big differences between the Piltovan and the Noxian languages. In fact, in those days before Arcane became canon, Piltover used to have two separate languages. There was the Piltovan language, which was called Piltovarian, and also Zaunite. Yes, these two languages used to be slightly different, with the Zaunite variant of their language being based on the original language that came from Zaun, which was the ancient Zaun that was part of the ancient Shuriman Empire. There is a long history behind that. So long story short, the original Zaunite language was a Shuriman dialect, with the Piltovarian being a more modern version of that. In Malphite's story, we actually learned about some Piltovarian slang. There, we had a Piltovan miner who said, "He'd you was essay on a square, was big teams taken?" Which was then translated into someone who understood him into, "We heard you were a good essayer, but we were sorely mistaken." So originally, it was kinda teased that the difference between the Piltovan and the Zaunite wasn't that big. It was kinda like the Czech language and Polish, I guess. You can understand each other like 50% of the time. But the thing is, in order for Arcane to avoid the language barrier that would break the pace of the story, the difference between the Piltovan and the Zaunite was never mentioned. And so, ever since Arcane became canon, we can assume there is just one language now. Although, what is odd is the lack of the Noxian language being mentioned. Because there absolutely should be a difference there. For example, when Ambassa originally arrived in Piltover, it was interesting to see her speak in Piltovan English, although that one can be easily explained. Ambassa can simply speak multiple languages. But in that case, technically speaking, whenever we had a flashback of Ambassa's story where she was talking to Mel on the Noxian home soil, why wasn't she speaking Noxian there? There is no way they would have used Piltovan under those circumstances. But of course, this was done in order to please the rule of cool. And cool always wins. Although, let's not forget that Arcane also confirmed that there is not just one universal English language. And that is because, in the one scene in the sewers where Jinx lost her finger, if you listen to the song in the background, you can actually hear the chanting of ancient Shuriman. This was directly confirmed by the producers behind Arcane. And of course, it makes sense for the song to use ancient Shuriman, because those sewers were part of the original city of Zaun. Anyway, outside of Arcane, there was one more time where the differences between the languages were mentioned in Piltover. And it happened in the Zed comic. During some of the later chapters, Zed, Shen, and Akali traveled to Piltover to hunt down Jinn. And there the comic referenced that nobody could understand each other. And Zed even mentioned that his Piltoverian was really bad. On top of this, when Akali went to the local markets and she talked to the shopkeepers, the shopkeeper of course spoke Piltoverian, which Akali couldn't understand, and so at first she tried to use multiple different Ionian dialects before they both agreed to speak Noxian. Of course, Akali would know how to speak Noxian because of the Noxian invasion, and in Piltover, they are dealing with Noxian all the time. Now, not only did this scene reveal that there is still absolutely a difference between all the different languages, but also, it made Akali's character so much cooler. And yes, even though the Piltovan language was shown in English text, in reality, the Piltovan script is very different from all the other languages, with their symbols being very unique. In contrast, compare this to the script of the Demacian language. This is what that language looks like in the written form. Speaking of which, let's talk about Demacian now. So Demacia actually had multiple versions of their own language. First, there was the ancient Demacian that came before the times of the big Demacian kingdom. We can assume that Kael and Morgana spoke this version of the language. And while it might have been slightly influenced by the Targonian languages, it is still more likely that it originated from the Noxian tribes. Now, what is cool is that this ancient Demacian actually has a slightly different script. This version of it looks a little bit more like runes, which totally makes sense. Because remember, Demacia became a thing after a whole bunch of people grouped together fleeing from the Rune Wars. And because the Rune Wars happened before the formation of the Noxian Empire, it is likely that the original Demacian language formed from the primitive Noxai languages. Because it is all of those people that fled here. This is important because it should be playing a role for the modern Demacian language. Because since both languages technically have the same ancestor, it would make sense for there to be some crossover between the Demacian language and the original Noxian. That could be why, when Katarina met Garen the first time, the two could just talk to each other. Or it could be why, when Xinjiao was captured by Noxians, which means he had to learn a new language, he didn't have any trouble talking to Jarvan after he got adopted by Demacians. Although again, in the case of Xinjiao specifically, his Ionian accent was always mentioned. Meaning that the Ionian language has to be different from Noxian at least. Which also makes sense because if the Noxian languages are based on the barbaric tribes of Noxus, well, Noxus didn't really spread outside of the main continent, so Ionia would be safe. Outside of this, there's also the case with Silas, who later on in his story traveled to Freljord. And once again, it was confirmed that the Freljordian language is very different from Demacian, because up in the Freljord, Silas couldn't understand anyone. And he literally had to find a Freljordian shaman who could translate for everyone else. Speaking of which, let's go into Freljord now. You see, Freljord is very interesting because when it comes to their languages, we only get breadcrumbs. And that's because while we don't really know what the modern Freljordian language is like, we do know one thing: a Freljordian swear word. Yes, swag is a very universal word for and you can see Sejuani using it a lot in the comic. Anyway, as I mentioned, while we don't know a lot about the modern language, there is a lot of references to the ancient Freljordian, which could indicate that Freljordians are using that language to these days. For example, when Ornn originally came out, he was teased with a song called A Path to Hearth Home. And while the text for this song was translated to English, the original lyrics were sang in ancient Freljordian. And of course, when Volibear got his VGU, in order to reference Ornn, he got his own theme called Ode to Ruin, which was also sang in ancient Freljordian. But Riot took that one a step further, because they also translated some of the words they use there. For example, Valir is Volibear's ancient Freljordian name. Vorjard is the word for the Freljord in ancient Freljordian. And so in the song you can hear the lyrics Vorjard Kalir, which can be translated as the Freljord calls you. And later you can hear Vorjard beoft, which can be translated as the Freljord needs you. Now, outside of ancient Freljordian, we can also mention one more thing, and that is the fact that the Yeti civilization was a thing. With the Yetis not only being very smart, but they also had their own language. And the only remnants of that we have is, technically, Willump. Unfortunately, all the other Yetis frenzied and they kinda stopped speaking their own language. But that's enough for Freljord, so now let's go into Ionia. Ionia is interesting because it has a lot of different versions. The most known one is the Old Human Ionian. Most people will know this one because there are two characters who shout words using this language. There is Yasuo and his infamous Hasagi! And sometimes you have Karma using the same language.
Sa elasa tirivi.
But outside of this old version of the language, there is also the modern Ionian. And this one should have many different dialects depending on the different regions of Ionia. In fact, Akali mentioned two of them in the Z comic. Of course, outside of this, Ionia also has the different Vastayan tribes, all of which have their own languages. I mean, some of Zaya's voice lines are actually referencing it.
That was a Vastayan farewell.
Isn't a Vastayan farewell when you say Ulabash?
I was trying to have a moment, Rakan.
But most of these languages will likely originate from the Vastai Shirei, which are the ancestors behind the Vastaya. And we did get a glimpse of that ancient language because of Nico.
Sehena. Oh, it means like, Wismayo forever. France! That is the word! France!
But what's even cooler than that is that technically the language that Nico is using is not even the first one. Because in the story of Master Yi, specifically in the short story where he talked to Master Doran, he entered a vision where he got to communicate with the original Vastai Shirei ancestors. We are talking about the ones who fought the original Titans, which is one of the first events that ever happened for a civilization on Runeterra. And in that story, it was mentioned that Master Yi couldn't understand them, so whatever language that was, it was one of the first ones. Anyway, surprisingly, in Ionia, there is one champion who had to deal with a lot of Ionian, and surprisingly, it is Riven. Because Riven was a Noxian soldier that was shoved into Ionia to fight for the glory of Borim Darkwill, I guess, while getting manipulated by the Black Rose, of course. After Riven deserted the Noxian legions, she tried to live a normal life in Ionia, which meant, in order for her to try and hide her Noxian accent, she had to learn the Ionian language. And in the Confessions of a Broken Blade story, which is where she really just tried to live a normal life, we got a glimpse of her trying to learn some of the words. And we learned that Fa'ir means father, Daeda is daughter, and Emai is mother. Also, in some of the stories from the Sisterhood of War, as well as some of Yasuo's stories, we learned about one interesting Ionian word, which is Zir, or Ziri. Simply said, this is a word for a curse. It is a misfortune for someone. But to be plain, Zir essentially translates as you. But Ionians are just very polite about it. And so next, why don't we get into a country that is not exactly polite, and so, let's get into Bilgewater. So, Bilgewater doesn't really have a language that would be native to the Bilgewater Bay. Because it is a trade city, they just speak whatever language just someone brought in. It is essentially a collection of travelers. But there is one language that is native to this place, and it is the Buru. This is the language of the native Buru priests that are located around the Bilgewater Islands. And of course, it has some origins in all the people worshipping Nagake Boros. But outside of that, Bilgewater doesn't really have much. So instead, right next to this, there is the Shadow Isles. Nobody's alive there. But before, it was the Blessed Isles, and the Blessed Isles did also have their own language. Now, because the people of the Blessed Isles were very advanced, we can assume that they could speak multiple languages. That is why in the Ruination book, Rise or Tyrus didn't really have an issue talking to anyone, but their own native language was never really mentioned. Outside of this, then there is Ishtal. Now, Ishtal is interesting because their language simply has to be very old. Because that entire nation is essentially one big bubble, they never really mixed with anyone. Although during the old times there were a lot of different mages who traveled here to study magic, and of course they came from different regions. So from a certain point of view, sure, there had to be some kind of a mix-up at the start, but it's safe to assume that language has not evolved a lot since Icathia happened. Speaking of which, yes, there is also Icathia and the Shuriman Empire. And yes, it is likely that after ancient Shurima fell, the local languages likely got mixed up with all the other explorers. But even in this case, it is interesting to see that the Shuriman language specifically has its own rules. They put the place of origin into most names. On top of this, when the Shurimans talk about the Voidborn, because yes, there are a lot of Voidborn in the deserts, they always use an apostrophe in those names. That's why you have something like Vel'Koz or Cho'Gath. Those names are technically Shuriman. And interestingly enough, this also happens when something was normal and then became Voidborn. For example, Kaisa used to be called Kaisa. But only after people started thinking that she was a void monster did they rename her into Kaisa. But going back to the idea of putting places into names, the Shuriman word for the desert is Sai. That's why on the map you have the Great Sai or the Great Desert. But using this word, they also created names for someone like Rek'Sai, which can be translated as the Scourge of the Desert, with her species being the Zersai, also named after the desert. Using this logic, since we know that Jax's original name was Sai-Jax, well, that would mean that he was Jax of the desert. Now just remember that Jax's full name is actually Sai-Jax Galarynx Ikathun, and that's because outside of just their homeland, the Shurimans also put their titles and their job into their name. And so, in Jax's case, the Ikathun means that he is a warrior of Icathia. Similarly, in the amazing story called Where Icathia Once Stood, there was Aksamuk Varchoi Koari Ikathor. This name contains the reference to the Koari, which are the elite warriors of Icathia, Aksamuk being the name of the ancient mage that founded Icathia, Varchoi could technically be the name of that individual, and Ikathor once again meaning that he is from Icathia. Now lastly, we can also mention that there is Belveth, which is the exact same case as someone like Kaisa. Belveth was named after the city, Belveth, which the void monster consumed. But that's it for Shurima. So now, moving a little bit more to the west, there is Targon. Now, Targon is also very likely a collection of different languages. And that is because people got onto Targon after an event that is called the Great Westward Migration. And even though the Targonian tribes are quite different on their own, as far as we know, they all speak the same language. And it was teased that the script of this language is inspired by the constellations. Interestingly enough, we also know that the celestial gods that are above Targon have their own language. Because when Leona originally ascended, she met one of the celestial gods and she couldn't understand them. And we can assume that it is only after someone ascends that they acquire that language. But that's pretty much it for Targon. So then we can also talk about Yordles. Now yes, in the last video, I forgot to mention them. So technically, let's just talk about the fact that the Battle City is a spirit realm, so in order for you to get there, I have no idea what would have to happen to you. Anyway, when it comes to their language, we have no idea how it works. We just know that Yordles can talk to anyone. I mean, Poppy could easily understand Orlon, Kled is constantly shouting at Noxians, and Heimerdinger was just fine in Piltover. So it is possible that the language of the Yordles gets automatically translated into everything through Yordle magic. But that is exactly where we make a full loop back to the beginning. You see, in order for people to really enjoy the universe of League of Legends, you need a lot of crossovers, and so sometimes you have to break the rules of immersion to make something cool. So when it comes to Yordles, let's just pretend it's all good. I mean, theoretically, when Azir was originally resurrected, shouldn't he be talking the ancient Shuriman language? If so, how come he just spoke to Sivern normally? And what about Kamavor? Kamavor is a whole continent somewhere in the east that is completely isolated from the rest of the world. And still, when Neela traveled to the west, she could talk to everyone. Then, when Vladimir, a Kamavoran prince, was traded to the Darkin in the west, once again, Vladimir spoke to them just fine, even though technically the Darkin should be using ancient Shuriman. Not to mention, when Viego traveled across the world during the Ruination, he talked to literally everyone, literally across the entire world, in literally every region. Then you have characters like Udir traveling from the Freljord to Ionia and talking to Lee Sin. Then you have Olaf traveling across the entire world from the Freljord to Bilgewater and being fine too. And there are many such cases. So, can the champions understand each other? Are there actually differences between the languages? Or are we playing into the idea that the Noxian really is the foundation for the world language? Honestly, I'll have to admit, I really like these moments where the different champions actually don't understand each other. That's where the immersion of this universe is really cool. It really feels like that's where we are in a real world. But it's been a while since Riot pulled off one of these moments, and it's likely they had to sacrifice all of this for a good communication in a story. So who knows? Maybe this is gonna be something they will explore in the Riot MMO. Or maybe this is something that will appear in a future series. But for now, we are getting further and further away from this immersion. And so all we can say is swag.